Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a tale of absolute, mind-boggling historical absurdity. We are talking about an era where cutthroat politics, intense religious divides, and frankly, some incredibly poor life choices all collided in the most disastrous way imaginable. We're going to unpack one of the longest, most complex, and utterly destructive conflicts in European history. But we're doing it through the lens of a ruler whose main contribution to the whole mess was, well, spectacular incompetence.
But before we introduce our main character, I want you to think about something for a second. It's a pretty relatable, modern question. When you fundamentally disagree with a politician or a government official today, what do you actually do, right? You might vote them out, maybe you go to a protest, or, let's be honest, you probably just write a really angry post online. But back in 17th century Europe, they had a very specific, highly aggressive, and shockingly literal solution to political gridlock.
You literally just threw them out a window. I am completely serious. In the Kingdom of Bohemia, specifically in Prague, the local elites were furious about Catholic suppression. So what do? They storm the Prague castle and toss two Catholic regents and their secretary straight out the windows of the chancery. No joke. This incredibly bizarre, violent event actually has a formal historical name. It's called the Defenestration of Prague.
Section 1. The Prague Window. The Spark of War. Section 2. The Church Divided.
Now, to understand the kind of deep-seated anger that leads to politicians literally flying out of buildings, we have to rewind the clock about a century to a German monk named Martin Luther. You've probably heard of him. He famously nailed his 95 complaints to a church door in Wittenberg, which essentially split Europe right down the middle. To keep things objective here, let's look at the core differences that fueled this massive societal rift. On one side, Catholics believed the Pope held the ultimate authority and that salvation required faith in God combined with good works and 7 specific religious rituals. On the flip side, Protestants argued that the Bible itself was the supreme source of guidance. They believed faith alone was enough, and they simplified things down to just 2 rituals. So basically, you had Catholics embracing a very complex, traditional structure, while Protestants were pushing for a radically simplified approach.
And the German people? They really took to these Protestant ideas. Plus, thanks to this groundbreaking, disruptive new piece of tech called the printing press, Protestantism basically went viral. It spread like wildfire across Germany and the rest of Europe. And the social tension? It was immense. We're talking about a divide that split entire nations and tore families apart. It got so intense that Catholic and Protestant youth weren't even allowed to date each other. If you were a good Protestant girl, bringing home a Catholic boy was absolutely off the table. That is just how deeply these theological arguments cut into the fabric of everyday life.
As this religious split got more and more intense, the heavyweights started to emerge, and the absolute undisputed heavyweights for the Catholics were the Habsburg dynasty. These guys controlled Spain, Portugal, parts of France, Italy, and the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. And they had a highly successful, historically accurate, if, let's be honest, slightly disturbing, 2-step formula for holding on to all that power. Step 1, incredibly strategic, calculated marriage proposals. Step 2, excessive inbreeding to guarantee that land never left the family. Nobody in Europe was foolish enough to want a direct fight with the Habsburgs.
Section 3. John's Great Dilemma.
This brings us to our so-called hero, Duke John George I. As the eldest son of the Duke of Saxony, this guy was next in line to inherit a massive governing seat right in the middle of this highly volatile, religiously fractured Holy Roman Empire. The pressure on him was just unimaginable. To give you an idea of the sheer scale here, there were over 300 different territories that John George could have potentially inherited. 300. And honestly, a lot of them were quiet, peaceful little spots completely out of the way of the looming religious wars.
But out of this 300 perfectly peaceful options, he gets Saxony, home of Wittenberg, the exact, literal ground zero where Martin Luther kicked off the entire rebellion 100 years earlier. Out of everywhere in Europe, John inherited the absolute ticking time bomb, right at the exact moment the entire continent was gearing up to explode.
Now, sitting on Europe's biggest ticking time bomb is understandably quite stressful. But instead of leaning into diplomacy or showing any real leadership, John chose a path of catastrophic incompetence. He turned to alcohol. And guys, he achieved horrific, historically unprecedented levels of drinking. The historical sources actually tell us that to manage his mounting anxiety, John was downing upwards of 20 liters of alcohol in a single day, completely abandoning his job as a ruler in the process.
Let's just pause and put that number into perspective for a second, because it's almost hard to wrap your head around. 20 liters is the equivalent of roughly 80 beers. 80 beers every single day. He drinks so much that he literally earned the nickname Beer Johann. When the stress of the impending war got to be too much, he would just retreat to his private vineyard, taste the local wine, and actively try to ignore the geopolitical nightmare that was quite literally destroying the lands right outside his front door. Naturally, his wife, Magdalena, was terrified. She's watching his health fail, then their territory crumble, so she decides a full-blown intervention is necessary. She sends the local pastor to deliver a sermon specifically targeted at John, basically warning him that his excessive drinking is destroying everything. Well, John, who was probably a bit tipsy during the actual sermon, completely missed the point. He thought the pastor was just looking out for him. So, as a thank you, John donated exactly 49.75 barrels of wine to the local church. And why that highly specific number? Because John publicly stated he didn't want the pastor to drink, quote, too much. You just can't make this stuff up.
Section 4. The 30 Years' War.
So while John is generously stocking his pastor's wine cellar and battling his complete lack of sobriety, the war outside explodes into 4 incredibly chaotic phases. And the absolute mess of this conflict is perfectly mirrored by John George's panicked, cowardly flip-flopping. In Phase 1, the Bohemian Rebellion, John was terrified of the Catholic Habsburgs, so he played it safe and stayed neutral. In Phase 2, the Danish attacked the Catholics. John saw an easy win, completely flipped sides to the Catholics, and helped crush the Danish. But then Phase 3 rolls around. The Swedish invade with advanced muskets and cannons. Seeing the Swedes winning, John abandons the Catholics and joins the Protestant Swedish king. But then, when that king actually dies in battle, John panics all over again, betrays the Protestants, and scurries right back to the Catholics for Phase 4.
By Phase 4, the French jump into the fray. And this is a really crucial turning point, because when the French enter, the war drops the religious facade entirely. France was a Catholic nation, but they declared war on the Catholic Habsburgs anyway. So the mask is off. It wasn't about Protestants versus Catholics anymore. It was purely a brutal game of global power and influence. John, of course, tried to switch sides yet again, but by this point, nobody was buying it. Because of his constant betrayals and absolute lack of backbone, his territory of Saxony was repeatedly overrun, looted, and utterly devastated by practically every army in Europe.
Section 5. Peace and Heartbreak. Finally, after 3 agonizing decades of relentless bloodshed, the major powers simply ran out of steam. They all dragged themselves to the table to sign the Treaty of Westphalia, basically because everyone was just too exhausted to keep swinging swords. This treaty was a massive deal. It fundamentally redrew the political map of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs completely lost their dominant stranglehold on Central Europe. France stepped up and became the shiny new European powerhouse. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic and Switzerland finally secured their official recognized independence. It was a complete geopolitical reset.
But before we wrap this up, we really need to look at the human costs here. Because while kings and emperors were busy signing fancy treaties in beautiful rooms, the everyday peasants paid the ultimate price. Between the endless battles, the resulting famines, and the rampant disease, roughly half of the population of modern-day Germany was wiped out. Half. Just let that sink in for a moment. And what about Beer Johann, the incompetent duke who betrayed literally every ally he ever had, got his own lands destroyed, and casually drank 80 beers a day while his people suffered? Miraculously, he didn't die of alcohol poisoning, and he wasn't killed in the war. He lived a perfectly healthy, albeit very large life, dying peacefully in his own bed at the ripe old age of 71. Half a population perishes for a power grab masquerading as religion, while the incredibly incompetent duke, who slammed 20 liters of booze a day, gets to die peacefully in his sleep. It really forces you to take a hard look at the absolute chaotic absurdity of the 17th century and ask yourself, is history ever truly fair?